This is Mae Brussell. The opinions stated in World Watchers are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of KAZU, its board, or the staff. This is Mae Brussell. This is broadcast number 551, and it's June 28th, 1982. I'm going to continue with my discussion of Watergate Part 3, 10 years later, after the entry at the Watergate Hotel. I do want to say that being on this station is a little bit different than where I was before for 11 years. This is a listener-sponsored station, and you should want to contribute to the station. They have a fundraising every couple of months or a couple of times. I don't know how often it will be, but whatever it is, I'll take part in it. Now, these broadcasts go to other stations around the country. World Watchers goes to other countries, and it goes to people who can barely afford to subscribe to the cassettes each week. And then there's other people who have quite a bit of money. And so I'm asking you, if you appreciate the fact that this is coming to you from the station, would you please send a contribution to the station? If you're listening locally, the subscription is $15 a year, and students, senior citizens are $10. Call the station in town here and pledge. 375-3082 is the number, but don't call between 7:30 and 8:30 because you'll miss World Watchers. So wait till the hour is over because, you know, it's a fact a minute and we rush along pretty fast. So I suggest you wait or send a check. If you want to write to the station and say thank you for having Mae Brussell, thank you for Kazoo, allowing this opportunity to share this information. It's Box 206, Pacific Grove, California, 93950. You can become a World Watcher and help the station at the same time. So whatever you have would be appreciated, and I'll remind you again at the end of the program. Now, before I get on to Watergate 3, I heard that the police department in Los Angeles is considering murder charges against the woman who was with John Belushi the night early morning when he was killed. I wonder what in the world took so long. I think some of you remember my very emotional, angry tape. What does it consist of when a person is there with you, injecting you, watching you, hearing the death rattle, going out to get something to eat? In this case, she said she was making a couple of dollar bets on the horses, comes back, and she was there when he was dead, comes back, brings all his paraphernalia, the cocaine, to implicate him into this drug scene. She's with the police, and they released her. Now, the reason this particular woman is speaking up now, and maybe you didn't read or hear about it, I just heard on one program several weeks ago, the LAPD told her to get out of town, and they chased her out, I guess. And when she got near Canada, the border on the way in New England, she had broken ribs. There was a car accident, and she was almost killed. So she has given an interview to Enquirer magazine, in National Enquirer, I believe it is, that she injected John Belushi 24 times from 2 in the morning until he was dead, 24 different times. Now, the police said for 4 or 5 days that they didn't know what was wrong with his body. They did an autopsy. They didn't say needle marks in the body. The complicity of the Los Angeles Police Department in the murder and drugging of the rock musicians has gone on. And I've been talking about this for years. And instead of taking this woman in, knowing that she was there when he died, she didn't call 911. She didn't call the desk where they were staying at the hotel there. She just left and came back after he was dead. She left. Now they're considering the fact that she has published that she did inject him 24 times and she was there when he was dead, and she says, I killed him. So the police say, well, maybe we should open it up in the John Belushi case. Why didn't they bring her in the first place? Because they have drugged and killed so many rock musicians. I've added up many of them. There's been a death squad around the country, and it wasn't because he was a rock musician alone. It was everything he was doing. And I think the most dangerous movie he was to make to prove his talent was that Moon Over Miami, where he was going to play an FBI dope dealer with drugs coming in from Colombia, and the FBI man, instead of investigating it, becomes the dope dealer, which is so very common in this country, all over the United States and around the world, where the police are actually the dope dealers. And I don't think a movie with somebody of this stature, the gentleman the one who wrote Atlantic City, wrote the script, and the one who directed My Dinner with Andre was doing that movie, Moon Over Miami. This is the kind of thing that Hollywood can't stand. It's okay for late night, Saturday Night Live to make fun of Henry Kissinger, or maybe it isn't. Okay, but when you get out to Hollywood and the big screens there and you have a whole new audience and generation and you're making fun of the truths, he's got to go. And no matter what people say, Belushi was a very political person in many, many ways, and so that this person was told get away. Now she is mentioning the fact that she murdered him, probably because they tried to kill her, I would guess, with a hit off the road, and she survived it. That's the only reason now. And because it's been so secret about her accident, it was an ordinary accident, why didn't we all see it? I heard it on TV news one night, I think it was on the program Entertainment, about her near-fatal accident. That's all I ever heard. Now to Watergate 3, I've done for 2 weeks what happened in 1972 and what's happening in 1982, because as I've studied Watergate for 10 years, it never was over, and Watergate goes back to the John Kennedy murder, and that never has been opened surgically and laid out on the table so you can understand it. So the same characters are still doing their ballet and covering up their bases. And I mentioned last week on Kazoo how the upper echelon were doing what I called the Black Sambo syndrome of chasing each other around and running scared. And I knew that there was an infight going on in Washington. And of course, this week there were two major events. One that I didn't know about when I went on the air, and that was John Hinckley Jr. cleared of all charges in the Washington, D.C. shooting. And the other was the firing of Alexander Haig. Now, last week I talked about various people, Edwin Wilson, Pope John Paul II, and the Vatican, and the Raymond Donovan connections, Raymond Donovan, the Secretary of Labor. And I'm going to talk about them and tie in now Mr. George Shultz, the new Secretary of State, to the very subjects I talked about last week. The Raymond Donovan connections to organized crime that I mentioned on this broadcast consisted of two people. One was Tony from the Tony Genovese family with Jack Ruby, and two names that came out were Tony Provenzano, involved with the murder of Jimmy Hoffa, and Salvatore Bergoglio, also involved with murdering Jimmy Hoffa. And I mentioned that Donovan's name had come up in connection with his construction company, his company in New Jersey, and tapes where these names were mentioned, and contacts with people who knew them and were involved with the Hoffa murder. And also just last week, a week and a half ago, Fred Perino, one of his major witnesses to the grand jury against him, was found in the trunk of a car while he was off in Switzerland. Well, 2 days after my broadcast on Kazoo, there was an article in the San Francisco Chronicle, United Press story, Witness Tells of Hoffa Plots. And in this front page story, it tells how testimony was given last week to the permanent subcommittee of the Senate on Atlantic City and organized crime, and a man named Charles Allen, who I talked about several years ago, or a year ago on my broadcast, said that Mr. Tony Provenzano and Mr. Bergoglio took Jimmy Hoffa and cut him into little pieces, ground him up in little pieces, and shipped him off to Florida and threw him in a swamp. That was just 2 days after this broadcast. Well, Hoffa is an important person in terms of the way he was done in, but also Ronald Reagan has now fired Alexander Haig, the Secretary of State. So who does he bring in? One of the men who had 3 positions in the Nixon administration. Now, the review of Watergate described by Senator John Siric, Judge John Siric, and Senator Sam Ervin, the corruption of the White House, the use of the various committees, the things that Richard Nixon was never impeached for, but the charges were listed, the use of the IRS, the Treasury Department, for getting people and sicking them on them to hurt them. The Labor Department was corrupt because the Secretary of Labor was in there at a time where Richard Nixon owed his election to a lot of things involving the killing of Robert Kennedy, who Jimmy Hoffa hated, and Frank Fitzsimmons of the Teamsters. And in the Nixon administration, there was called in Mr. George Shultz, who came directly to Richard Nixon. He had 3 jobs. He was Secretary of Labor at the time that Nixon had just come into power. He was Secretary of Labor from 1969 to 1970, when Fred Fitzsimmons was playing golf with Nixon over at the courses, and they made a deal with Hoffa. Hoffa could get out if he didn't want Fitzsimmons' job, and then Hoffa was sprung out of jail and then ground up in those little pieces. Well, our new Secretary of State was Secretary of Labor when all the mob connections of Richard Nixon were going full swing, and many of you have the book, or if you don't have it, I'll read on the air some night, on the crimes of Richard Nixon and the release of several hundred mob figures that he released at that time who were involved with tax evasion and financial matters that would also have to do with the Treasury. And George Shultz was Secretary of Labor. He then went to Office of Management Budget. That was a new group that was put together by Richard Nixon, and this OMB involved Roy Ashe and Litton Industries. It was the office that had put in the Greek military junta and fascism in Greece, and they worked with Tom Pappas of the CIA and Spiro Agnew. The Office of Management Budget was a corrupt group of people with Fred Malek, who's now in the new administration. And then he went on, Mr. Shultz, to be the Secretary of the Treasury under Richard Nixon. Now, the IRS under Richard Nixon had brought in Jack Caulfield, who was doing murder threats to people like James McCord, who worked for the New York Police Department. The Treasury Department under Nixon had a deal with an agent, Larry Shears. They were supposed to kill Cesar Chavez and Eldridge Cleaver at the time. I even have tape recordings of a press conference and the voices of members from this alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. This is the Treasury Department. And also Richard Nixon's Treasury Department was using this agency. They brought in G. Gordon Liddy to the Treasury Department. I've had on the celebration of tax time for several years my letter to the IRS that what was coming down in 1972 in the Treasury Department. And of course, I've said that David Kennedy, who was Secretary of the Treasury later, along with George Shultz in the Nixon administration, has now been charged with murder of an investigator and public official in Milan, and for millions of dollars taken out of Milan. If ever there was a corrupt administration, it was the Richard Nixon administration. And how could people laud a man like George Shultz as being just an angel? He's a team player. Darn right he's a team player. He was with a group of people who caused so much trouble all out throughout this country in every way, tampering the electoral policies and the Democratic offices and so forth. He has invited this team player to his administration to now become Secretary of State. There was a shocking article about Donovan and the White House today that I again think if it's followed properly, this could be the Reagan Gate, or it's getting close to it, and maybe George Bush is pulling these things. I wouldn't like to have the director of the CIA as my vice president. But the San Jose Mercury has a story today. Donovan Company sleuths have ties to the White House. Now, Time magazine this week is going to tell you that Mr. Donovan turned some people loose to find out about the investigators against him, and that they were actually working for the White House. That Time said that the man picked by the Chavone Company, that's Donovan's company, to head its investigation, Robert Shortley, is a former FBI agent and a longtime friend of Edward Hickey, an assistant to the president and the director of the Special Supports Services for the White House. And furthermore, Shortley's wife, Maisel, works at the White House as an aide to Morton Blackwell, a liaison with conservative groups. And it is said that Anthony Dolan, a speechwriter, is Shortley's brother-in-law. So you have a nice little clique that are connected to Chavone Company, Donovan's company in New Jersey, three of them linked to the White House, so that people inside the White House were working for Donovan to discredit our Congress. Now, the President of the United States should want to know if a cabinet appointee has links to organized crime. Now, that's just redundant. It's really silly to talk about it. He knows they have, just as Nixon knew who was at the Watergate Hotel. But now there's a whole family of people related to the construction company of Donovan, so you haven't heard the end of it. And Senator Robert Byrd wrote a letter to the newspaper this last week, June 22nd, 1982, the day after I was on the broadcast last week, asking, it was a letter to the New York Times about Donovan and asking that he go. And then he said, this is a man who has close personal and business ties with known members of La Cosa Nostra. Now, I don't think Senator Robert Byrd would say that lightly. He protects just about everything that walks or agrees with him that's on 2 feet. So he writes this in the New York Times, and then he says, this is a man who meets regularly with the president, particularly in cabinet meetings. And on the same day the Post story appeared about the Cosa Nostra, he represented our country before the United Nations International Labor Organization and met with the Pope. Oh, heavens forbid, I'll do some more in a few minutes on the Pope and the Gambino family and Michael Sandone and Ronald Reagan and Licio Gelli and a large $76 million lawsuit against the Combine, and even involving the name of Alexander Haig. So he isn't apart from this story and the dope and the missing money in Europe and NATO. And there was a combination of reasons why Haig left office fast, but there were straws that broke the camel's back. And I'll get into those some more. As I say, the San Jose Mercury last week mentioned Tony Provenzano and Brugiglio in the links of the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa to Donovan. Well, why is it so important that Donovan stay on with these kind of links? One important piece of information is that Edward Bennett Williams, the attorney, the office that represented John Hinckley Jr., was the attorney for Jimmy Hoffa. Now, Edward Bennett Williams knows who killed Jimmy Hoffa. He knows where the bodies are, and he can get a weak prosecution for their client because they know who killed Jimmy Hoffa. It isn't strange that it just came out this week, the day that Hinckley gets off. The following day, they tell you that Hoffa was ground into little pieces of meat. And also, Edward Bennett Williams, the attorney for Vincent Fuller from the office of Edward Bennett Williams, who represented John Hinckley Jr. Williams is also the attorney for Richard Helms, who's an advisor to the Bechtel Corporation, that our new Secretary of Labor, George Shultz, is the president of. He's the attorney for Richard Helms, and it even gets worse. But you can see the can of worms that's going on back there. Bechtel's president is brought in as a Secretary of State, the attorney for Jimmy Hoffa and the little pieces of meat, and for Richard Helms from the Bechtel Corporation, former director of the CIA, when many murders were going on. This is what they're tangling with. Get Hinckley off, have a weak prosecution. We won't bring your house down for the Hoffa chewing up, the little slicing up. Okay? Now, at the press conference today on Donovan, the chief investigator was asked, do you say now that there's categorically no links to organized crime? And the answer is insufficient credible evidence was developed. It wouldn't be developed if they worked 4 years, because that man is too stupid to put his life on the line, and he's just not going to develop it. He can spend 6 months and 20,000 tons of paper and show you a prodigious investigation. That has nothing to do with it. Now, I mentioned last week on the broadcast the Travelers. I called the program The Travelers, Ronald Reagan and a hot time in Switzerland and Houston, Texas. Reagan was in Houston, Texas last week. This is the city where the money came, the financing for the murder of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. It was combined between there and Atlanta, Georgia, the actual footwork for it. And he was down there just at a time before John Hinckley Jr. was released. June 21st, John Hinckley Jr. was released, all charges. He'll be out and sent home to Mommy, who's sitting there crying for him. And just a few days later, June 25th, 4 days later, Alexander Haig was out, O-U-T. Hinckley's innocent, and Haig is out. And the most outrageous statement of the lawyer, Vincent Fuller, in the Williams office was, headline San Francisco Chronicle, I don't know what you get east and around the country, was another day, another dollar. And that's what business is in Washington. That office got $500,000. James Brady, the former press secretary, has 20% of his brain blown out. 4 men wounded. Another day, another dollar. You people are paying the taxpayers' money for all medical support for Brady for the rest of his life. He's literally a vegetable. You may not have money to go to a hospital, but you're going to have to pay for his care, and you paid for his therapy and surgery, and every time he has more surgery out of your tax dollars, just reach in your pocket and pay for James Brady, and the Hinckleys give the attorneys $500,000, another day, another dollar. Now, when Haig was out, there was a chronology of disputes that went on in the White House, but one important story, an AP story, says The problems began with Inauguration Day when Haig wanted a complete power to himself, and then in March he was feuding with Vice President Bush over the domestic international emergency unit. You remember that. And they said the day Reagan was shot, this is in black letters, Haig and Weinberger had sharp words when Haig got on national television and said he was in control. And the New York Times story by David Schreiben on Haig's being out says Haig's tenure was controversial from the start. And perhaps the most controversial act was in the third month in office after Reagan was shot at the Washington Hilton as Vice President George Bush was flying to Washington from Texas. Haig appeared on television and announced he was in control here in the White House. Weinberger said, "I can't believe that. What is that guy doing and under what authority?" Now, that wouldn't have gotten them so mad. We're talking about a year ago in 3 months, and he's represented the United States down the Falklands and flying back and forth to England, and still the head of NATO and set up the Bonn Conference. What pulled him out 4 days after Hinckley was out? I think it's because Hinckley was out, and Ronald Reagan was in Texas, the stronghold of the CIA and John Connally and the George Bushes and the Hinckley family, and I think he called halt, you leave me alone and I'll get off your back. I think he ran down there to see the governor of Texas, who also lived on the same street as the Hinkleys at one time when they were in Texas. But I think Haig's quick departure had as much to do with the past as it had to do with his giving the go-ahead to the tragedy that's going on in Lebanon. And I'll tell you why I believe he had more approval for that. Now, we haven't heard the end of the Hinckley case. The victims are going to sue the family for $72 million, and they may call John Hinckley on the stand. And I will try to send copies of cassettes that I made on the Hinckley story to this group and see maybe in a civil suit, because that's where it has to be done. They would entertain the idea. Now, one night before Ronald Reagan was shot, I was on the radio. That was a Sunday night in those days. And the topic of the program was the top dogs are fighting musical chairs. And I hit it again the night before Lennon was shot, the night before Reagan was shot, and the week before Haig was out. And I mentioned Alexander Haig and his wanting control of the government and the team players that were fighting. I mentioned Haig, Stetzel, Richard Pipes, Richard Allen, and William Casey. Well, Haig is out, Allen is out, and I'm sure the next to go will have to be William Casey. He has to go next because he's part of the same team. And I did many broadcasts on Ronald Reagan and this John Hinckley family, and knew from the moment they hired Edward Bennett Williams that there was no way that Hinckley would go to jail. He has the goods on everybody in the United States. As a matter of fact, it was broadcast 489, this is April 19th, a year ago. And I listed some of the clients of Edward Bennett Williams. And if you know anything about American history, you know then that John Hinckley isn't going to go to jail. Besides the Watergate defendants, the keys to them, he was the lawyer for Jimmy Hoffa, for the Kennedy family, for the Teamsters Union, for Senator Joe McCarthy, for Robert Mayu of the CIA, who hired the assassination teams, for Major William Holohan, he's the head of the OSS, Robert Vesco, with his links to Richard Allen and Fred Fielding of the White House, Bobby Baker, of course, close ties to Lyndon Johnson, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, the family who made a mistake and hired him, of Ronnie Moffat and Orlando Letelier, Richard Helms of the CIA, as I say, the consultant to Bechtel Corporation, Robert Mullen of the Mullen Associates at the time of Watergate, the CIA Howard Hughes office, John Connally, who was Secretary of the Navy, the Treasury, the Governor of Texas, and so forth. With those kind of clients, you know that there is no way to get John Hinckley Jr. in the clink. In fact, he never went to jail. He was at a military base, at a Marine base, the entire time. He never went to a city jail or a federal prison. He was a military prisoner. He shot the president and he got off. And if any of you want my back tapes on the Hinckley and Reagan murder attempt, the assassination attempt, you can write to me or call me or send a self-addressed stamped envelope, and I'll tell you how to get those back tapes. I don't want to rewrite on the air again what I've already done. Important, March 30th, 1981, Ronald Reagan was shot. May 3rd, 1981, There was a NATO meeting where Alexander Haig, was with the Pope. And May 13th, 10 days later, John Paul II was shot. And of course, his assailant, as I've said, was linked to Edwin Wilson, Frank Turple, the CIA, and the people that worked with George Bush when he was the director of the CIA. Now, updating Edwin Wilson, who came last week, because I said that was of primary importance. Edwin Wilson was arrested in New York. He picked up $18 million in Zurich, Switzerland. He will get off too, like John Hinckley. He's not going to be charged for any of the crimes he's done, just to name a few, such as arranging the murder of Sadat for Mubarak. Okay? At the office of Tursum, it was called Tursum in Switzerland. Jack Anderson did a marvelous article on this that nobody has picked up that I know of the way they should. Edwin Wilson came home. He's an important person to come home because he, like Edward Bennett Williams, knows the whole era in the assassination teams. And after my broadcast on Wilson coming home, I said last week that he would sacrifice Arafat and end the PLO. It was getting too close with Turple and Kurkola talking in Europe and various witnesses like McCullough of the CIA and investigations around the country and also going into the Nugan Bank in Australia. It's too close to run the terrorist game anymore. Carlos and the PLO have to slow down because it was always the CIA. I wrote the SLA as the CIA. So you can't run an operation like that when the people are over there making $820 million telling you how it happened and who they work with. So Jack Anderson had a very important article in our paper out here on the 25th. That was 4 days after the broadcast I had with you last week. And the highlights of what he said in his article were these. He said that Edwin Wilson told him that he was working for the CIA while he was overseas, that he was feeding information to the CIA during his exile and contributed important background information, and that is true. It has been known by people who have studied this for a long time that they were not renegade people. They didn't leave the agency. They didn't get all this equipment from these bases and from these airplane companies and these huge cargo planes for Gaddafi. They didn't run the torture centers for Amin on their own, and all that equipment and the training came from the United States and Gaddafi's equipment for terrorist schools and Carlos's operations. Wilson has said in this article, Jack Anderson, the Justice Department met with him in Europe to discuss bringing home two men, Mr. Suarez and Mr. Paz, who were wanted for the assassination, part of the role in killing Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffat. And I mentioned that he was dangling two minor people instead of Mr. Contreras and George Bush and General Vernon Walters, our roaming ambassador for the United States. They want to pick up two poor Chileans and leave the top order clean, which we do in all investigations. He also said that he worked with naval intelligence. The article doesn't go on to say that Bobby Inman, who just resigned from the CIA, was his boss, and that George Bush was his boss, the CIA. And Wilson said last week that he met in Rome with a federal U.S. prosecutor last year. And I mentioned last week on the air, he met in Rome after the Pope was shot at and the murder attempt, the guns and the equipment and the training of Ajah with the Grey Wolves and the Nazis in Beirut, Lebanon, and in Frankfurt, Germany, around the world had to do with the network that Wilson, Turper, and Kurkola had set up. And then he said, and this is the real role of Edwin Wilson, if you want to know what all the brahoo was about, he said that he was very patriotic because Gaddafi wanted the atomic bombs, that a man in Belgium was diverting atomic bombs to Gaddafi. But what did he do with them? He said, I gave them to Saudi Arabia. Okay? Now, Israel has atomic bombs, but here is Mr. George Shultz, who is building the airports and the cities in Saudi Arabia, and our Secretary of Defense from the Bechtel Corporation. Shultz is the president of it. Weinberger is the attorney for it, and they have been 180 degrees to the right in terms of Saudi Arabia. They build for 100 countries, but they won't sell a stone to Israel, and they don't build with Israel. And now Mr. Wilson's true colors come out, and he says, diverted it. He said either Syria or Saudi Arabia. Well, just forget the Syria. We've had lots of missing plutonium. Here's George Shultz and Weinberger with Saudi Arabia, and now a Belgian has provided the atomic bombs for Saudi Arabia. We'll take a 1-minute break and then get back with you in one moment. Okay, this is Mae Brussell on side two. I wanted to make sure I had that tape correct. Sometimes we record off the air, and last week I had to do it over again, so I wanted to make sure. You'll give me that 1 minute, okay? As far as going, I want to talk briefly about the role of Edwin Wilson and having to sacrifice the PLO at this time, and Arafat, and later it'll be Gaddafi, but first it's Arafat. There were some articles in the newspaper that caught my eye and what is going on in Lebanon, and because the links of Turple and Wilson, and they hang out in Beirut, what is going on at this time. Well, one of the interesting articles was from the Houston Post. This was June the 6th, and it says suspects in attack on envoy believed tied to 2 other shootings. And this was the story of the shooting of Mr. Argov, the Israeli ambassador to London, to Great Britain. At the time he was shot, he hasn't passed away, but he was very seriously wounded. 4 people were caught, and they had a list on them of people that they were going to kill, and it was something that was left behind. That it was a document, according to the Houston Post, and it was seized after the attack, and it was the possibility of a death list, and it listed prominent Israelis in London, but it also had other pieces of information that made the connection of them to attacks in Paris, where 2 people were killed and others were wounded. One was the U.S. military attaché Charles Ray, who was shot January 18th by a Lebanese terrorist group in France. And what I think happened when Israel poured their excuse for going into Lebanon was this particular shooting. But what I believe, with Edwin Wilson coming home and with that list available, they decided once and for all to clean out, and that the United States government had no way to stop what they were going to do until they got the PL out, and even said, okay, go ahead and do it, get Arafat, the Edwin Wilson sacrifice, because that list must have had something that tied the hands of the United States government. The President and the United Nations and the Congress have been so quiet about the death of 10 or 11,000 people, the decimation of a city, that there's no way that they would allow Israel to do this thing on the slightest provocation. And when this list was left behind, I bet you it had the names of people that would have caused more international trouble than if it wasn't there. To give an example, when McCord and the Watergate defendants were taken to jail that night, when they were arrested, Bernard Barker had the name of Mr. White and the White House phone number, and it suggested, from what he had in his notebook and the receipts and the money he had on him, that the operation came not only from money in Florida, but it went back to Washington, D.C., to the committee to reelect the president. Then it went to Texas, to the Gulf company there, and then it went overseas and down to Mexico in international money. So that when these men were arrested, that were linked to other murders in Paris, and a list is left behind, that signaled not only, as I say, Wilson comes home, he quickly goes to Zurich for $18 million. How would he? It's supposed to be bait for settling somewhere else, but he would leave himself that vulnerable in Zurich. So that when these men left behind the list and what other information it was on, Wilson comes home, then Israel goes on into Lebanon. Now, there's one article in the San Jose Mercury. This was a wire service story. The leftist says now PLO leaders must face reality. You know, the highest echelon of our government must be giving these orders. Face reality, it's up. What's up was that there were pieces found in London that trace them to murders all over the world that will trace to Carlos and Wilson and Turple and Corcola. And they have to stop this international terrorism that is funded not by Russia, but by the Central Intelligence Agency. Another article this week, June 24th. The Christians see the invasion as a chance for power. The CIA and the Defense Department wants the Christians to take over in the area, and they're welcoming Israel. Why aren't we responding in anger? Because they had to have the approval of the world to do this thing. Another article in the San Francisco Chronicle from the Washington Post. Christians, the uneasy alliance with Israel. Why are they, again, lining up? The whole place is being in rubbles and people displaced and dying. We hear about 4 nuns in El Salvador. My goodness, what is going on here? Not a word. Then another article Jack Anderson had in the paper this last week. the Israel prediction was ignored. And this is the fact that the Defense Department and the director of the agency, Eugene Rostow there, knew in advance that Israel wanted and was going to do this thing. But what triggered it was, they didn't take that seriously, but what triggered it was the killing, or the attempted killing rather, in London. And even though they knew that Israel was mad at the PLO, they never would have gone out on their own. And then another final thing to convince me that Congress knows something and Washington knows something that they don't want you and I to know is that June 24th, the United Press had a story. The House of Representatives okays $50 million for relief in Lebanon. Now, how can you fund the people who are killing them and tearing the town down, and then you, me, taxpayers, again, dip in your pocket? Okay, you're going to pay for Mr. Brady's medical care and therapy and his necessities for the rest of his life. Now you're going to send $50 million to Lebanon. While it's being shelled, the House voted 334 to 70 to send aid to Lebanon, and we're saying weapons to Israel. Why are we sending aid to Lebanon? Why aren't we asking Israel to pay for it? Because we must have had the go-ahead. Now, Alexander Haig is taking the fall for this. He allegedly is the one that gave the go-ahead, you can go on in. But as the Soviet Union said, and I don't think they're far off, Haig is taking the heat for a policy that was decided a while back, and when it triggered, with one more event, they went ahead. What the president was mad about was that he spent $10 million for his awful trip to Europe, where he made a fool of himself 100 times, looking like a world leader. And this was going on while he was at Bonn. It would have been put off if it hadn't been for the attempted murder in London, but it coincided with his trip, and the Israelis moved, and they didn't care how Ronald Reagan looked anyway. He's not going to look so great in a few years anyway, so it doesn't matter whether you wait a week to have a party. So they pulled it out while he was there, and then he didn't have his cue cards of what to say because he wasn't ready for it. So he's blaming Haig for doing it while he was on his trip. But in that sense, Haig can't stop the Israelis, but we're sending them money, and we're sending Lebanon money, and the general consensus, even the Democratic Party at their meeting this last Sunday, they were supporting Israel going into Lebanon. Now, as I say, it is a tragic situation, and most of this country supported us going into Vietnam. It has nothing to do really with Israel alone. This has to be a policy, just as we went into Cambodia or Laos, and you didn't know about the secret bombings for years until the time of Watergate. You don't know, and I don't know what deals are made, but some kind of a deal was made, and it's all of our responsibility. Now, last week I talked about John Paul II. He was at that labor meeting with Raymond Donovan in Geneva, and while he was there, a man was picked up in Bern who supplied the gun for his shooting. And Roberta Calvi, that important link to the Vatican, had gone and asked for some money, for $26 million, to bail him out because he was going to be tried on this swindling deal. And Paul Marcinkus, the Archbishop of the Special Discretionary Fund, turned him down. And then he was found hanging off a bridge in London, and his secretary went out a fourth-floor window in Milan. All that was going on last week. And I got an article out of the Philadelphia Daily News right after I was on the air. It came the next day about an arrest pertaining to this subject. Arrest in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, of a man. His name is William Arrico, the Exterminator. This is from the Philadelphia Daily News. A fugitive was captured in Bucks County. He has been under indictment in Italy for the murder of an investigator probing the financial empire of Michael Sindona, who's now in jail for defrauding a New York bank of $45 million. William Arrico, 45 years old, the Exterminator, known as Chili Willie, he left the Rikers jail. He swam away in New York City. He got out of that jail, and he was living in Buck County until the stories broke in the international scene, the Geneva arrest, the Roberta Calvi story, the secretary dying. Then all of a sudden, the police go in and they pick up this man, this fugitive, the Exterminator. Sedona was named in the same indictment as Arrico in Milan, Italy. This is the financier for the Vatican. They're charged with ordering the assassination of Mr. Ambrosoli, who was shot to death July the 11th, 1979. 4 other investigators in this case have also been killed. And as I say, our Secretary of the Treasury, David Kennedy, under Richard Nixon, was also named, along with Sedona, for the murder of one particular person and for millions of dollars missing out of the banks in Milan. Well, the exterminator was picked up living in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, since I was on the air with you last. And getting back to Michael Sindona and that P2 scandal in Italy, just to review it for you, and the role of Alexander Haig in this, and again, this has to do with Haig, and this is why I'm bringing up what I did last week, and it ties in with Haig. One article in the Washington Post last year, at just this time, May 26, 1981, scandal erupts over the Italian Masonic Lodge. Alleged members appear on the list. The minister is forced to resign. Now, this is about Licio Gelli, who fled Italy and went down to Argentina and has direct links to the Vatican and the Vatican funds and Michael Sindona. Mr. Gelli had arranged the fake kidnapping of Sindona after he was arrested for the swindles of the New York banks and brought him back to Italy. That's when they were charged with the murder of this primary witness. Two of the top bankers in the scandal, one is Roberto Calvi, was arrested in 1981. Only a few weeks ago, Calvi bought 40% interest in a new newspaper in Italy, Corriere della Sera. It's not a new newspaper, but he bought a newspaper. Roberto Calvi was working with Licio Gelli and Michael Sindona, the one that was murdered last week. Now, there's a book out called Dope Incorporated, and this Jeff Sternberg wrote this book quite a while ago, and he updated his book for a publication, New Solidarity, that sometimes I accept their material and sometimes I read it skeptically, but New Solidarity, May the 10th, 1982, talks about the relationship of dope and heroin to Michael Sindona, to the Vatican, and he also mentions that when Sindona was brought to trial in New York City in March 81, his attorney, and this is true, I have this from other articles, subpoenaed Secretary of State Alexander Haig, former CIA Director Stansfield Turner, former U.S. Ambassador to Italy Graham Martin, Admiral Thomas Moore, that's the admiral that was stealing and bugging Richard Nixon in the White House and taking tapes with Yeoman Rufford and Henry Kissinger and bugging the President of the United States, and now he's called as a witness to this scandal that involves many murders and millions of dollars missing, and former Secretary of the Treasury, David Kennedy. Now, in all of this, while these things were going on and David Kennedy leaves the Nixon administration, of course, George Shultz is in there, I say, with the Teamsters scenes, with the fantastic web of Michael Sindona and Licio Gelli and that Masonic Lodge. Another article in New Solidarity recently, in January 1982, Michael Steinberg wrote, in the final days of the search for the kidnapped NATO General James Dozier, you remember that, the government indicted 76 leaders in Italy of $600 million a year heroin traffic coming out of Palermo, Sicily, involving the Gambino family. Now, this heroin charge named Michael Sindona, a banker in New York City, the banker for the Vatican, with tangled web to Sicilian mafia. And the article says the story of this most recent Sicilian organized crime is not the history of a 500-year-old secret society known as the mafia. It's a scandal involving the Secretary of State, Alexander Haig. And I bring this up now because Roberto Calvi was hung last week in London, and the secretary went out the window and Haig was fired. But with Calvi's death, just as with the death of the Israeli envoy in London, cataclysmic events fell down this week. This article says he has former links with the CIA and the Duke of Kent in England and with Thomas Dewey of New York City. Of course, Thomas Dewey released Lucky Luciano to set up the organized crime syndicate in Europe, and when the OSS became the CIA, Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano and the organized crime married our intelligence organization and made a three-partner arrangement. The Nazis from Germany, from Hitler's Germany, the crime syndicate, and our intelligence organizations, and also our public officials. Many of you are too young to remember when Tom Dewey was doing all of this in the midst of these mafia connections. He ran for president of the United States, and his vice president in that election year was Earl Warren, who became the head of the Warren Commission to investigate who killed John Kennedy and left out the Nazi and the mafia connections. So Alexander Haig is mentioned in various sources going back to the Washington Post, May 1981. 5 people on leave from Italy's top government were linked to Alexander Haig. There's Admiral Teresi, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that worked in NATO with Haig. He'd been appointed January 1980. General Santovito, the head of the Military Secret Service, who worked with our Pentagon and Haig. General Grassini, the head of the Domestic Secret Service, the Secret Intelligence Security Service of the Interior Ministry. General Giannini, commander of the Customs Police, and in charge of the customs in Italy, and Walter Pelosi, the director of the Secret Service. All 5 of them took a leave of absence. All 5 of them were linked to NATO and NATO meetings with Alexander Haig, and attended May 80 these NATO meetings just days before the Pope was shot, and the Pope's intended death was linked to the American intelligence. And one reason the Pope was shot was that he got wind of the P2 scandal and the intention to overthrow the government and put in a fascist dictatorship. And this was all coming down within 1 week. The NATO people that were involved, the scandal was breaking, the Pope was shot, and there'd been the attempt 2 months earlier to kill Ronald Reagan. Another article that did come out of the Executive Intelligence Review along these lines: Haig, Kissinger named in Italian conspiracy coup. I can copy this article if any of you want copies. It's 4 pages, and if you want copies of this, or I can go into more details later. But the important thing is that Roberto Calvi was killed last week, and after he died, Haig was out, and after Hinckley was free of all crimes, Haig was off, and the scandals around the President of the United States and the intelligence community are so great that it would take a long time, if you don't know these names, to untangle them. If you want sheets or bibliography of this program, you can send to me. I send a self-addressed stamped envelope, and I'll give you the sources of the newspaper article and the reference that you can look them up. Another article, a separate source from the Newsday, January 1982, that was sent to me by a World Watcher in New York City. 76 indicted in Italian drug case, and those involved John Gambino of the United States, Michael Sindona, and the laundering of money, the U.S. Italian drug money. Mafia controls the $1 million drug business from the Middle East and to the United States and Northern Europe. So there is a web of commerce going on all the time, protected by the United States and the authorities and the Justice Department, that never ends. And this is going to go on until we look into who is killing some of these people and finally trace it to those organizations that cover up other crimes and past crimes, and finally lay it all out and stop this silly business and get public servants that don't represent anyone, the Cosa Nostra, the Gambino family. I mean, there was a time, I guess, where the mafia organized crime syndicate did put money into the pockets of politicians to run for office. But this network goes so high from the White House on down, and they'll keep shifting position and bringing in their old cronies until there is a admittance on some people's parts that the reason those people are in power, such as bringing in George Shultz at this time, has more to do not with his economic theories at all, that holding the dike because the ship is sinking. There was a large article in the San Francisco Examiner this past Sunday. The last spat, Haig versus Bush. Shouting match with the vice president preceded the resignation. Well, what is new? They were shouting the minute the administration came in office in January. They were shouting when Reagan was shot. They have tangled with each other, but as I tried to explain last week on this program, that they have always had differences with each other, but there is a power story here. Edwin Wilson coming home, and he worked with George Bush. Haig involved with the Italian scandal, and that scam, the NATO, the Vatican. He always refers to himself as the vicar. In fact, Tom Braden, I think on the TV this morning, said instead of an army uniform, we'll now see a bow tie, that the military man is out. He should wear a church collar. The vicar is out. But what you had was Haig very close to the Vatican, to the church. That doesn't mean they don't have a lot of control in the next group coming in. But Haig had his own problems, and George Bush has his as the director of the CIA when these scandalous murders were happening, and the money is still missing from the Nuganan Bank with all those death-related incidences. You know, how many bodies linked right immediately. There were 10 right after the bank failure came into full view, and one of them alone was John Paisley, who had direct links to Lee Harvey Oswald and Navy intelligence in the Soviet Union. So the Bush is trying to hide the links of Navy intelligence and the CIA to assassination teams around the world, and he slipped in as the director at the time of Watergate to hold that. And Haig is trying to hide the Permindex, the connections of Italy and Madrid and Argentina, and his team with the Buckleys and their role of international fascism with Otto Skorzeny in Madrid and the killer team operating from that end. There are several branches that work together, and in the well-known Torbett document, the description of the assassination cabal that killed John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, there were 5 prongs. So what you're getting now is several elements fighting each other. The crime syndicate is not a big part of this as much as the intelligence agencies covering their losses for so many murders that they have done in the past years. And I knew last week that the news would be cataclysmic, and of course this week it's just absolutely fascinating. Now, George Shultz is been appointed the Secretary of State. He doesn't know much about foreign affairs, they say, but he'll take his direction from Reagan. Well, when is Reagan going to learn it? He uses cue cards. The background on Shultz, I'll give you a little bit, and we'll do more next week. He went to Princeton, and he was born in New Jersey, and went to Princeton. Everyone calls him a California man, okay? He came to California, and this is very, I want you to understand this and get this loud and clear. He took 3 jobs with the Nixon administration until the ship was sinking, and when there was no way Richard Nixon was going to last any longer, he takes himself to California and becomes the head of the Bechtel Corporation that was already 100 years old. He comes to California, to Bechtel, to manage that, okay? Now, he was not a California person at all. Why did he come to Bechtel? Because when Richard Nixon was groomed from the House of Representatives to the Senate to the vice presidency, he lost the election in 1960 to Kennedy. He could help. He was in Dallas the day Kennedy was killed. He could help with the Bay of Pigs operation, the anti-Castro Cubans, with E. Howard Hunt, with Bernard Barker and Frank Sturgis, Frank Fiorino, all of them a finger in the Kennedy murder. He got himself back in the White House. But you don't have a one-time shot. You got to groom him again. Ronald Reagan was being groomed. He was the governor of California, 1968 to 1974, and the only thing you have to do to get him elected is to kill the Kennedy brothers, Robert Kennedy and Richard Nixon, and Ronald Reagan is ready for office. So he's the governor of California. He's going to be through in 1974. So Shultz, he makes himself available. He comes out to California where the next president is going to be. Things don't happen. I have an article next week that I'll share with you on the life of Shultz, and it says, don't think that things just happen. By 1973, he was the czar of Washington. He controlled foreign money, domestic money. He had the power when the Nixon administration was falling apart. He was born in New Jersey, where so many of these tanglements seem to be going on, and I could do a program, just one on Atlanta, Georgia, and one on New Jersey. He was in New Jersey, then he went to Princeton, and then he went to MIT, where he did science research, and then he taught at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He was a professor on industrial relations. Then he was the dean of the University of Chicago at the school out there from 1962 to 68. And he was also in part of the office of the Secretary of U.S. Labor at 59 to 1960. He got a grantee from the Ford Foundation, and he spent a really funny year from 1968 to 1969 as a fellow for the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Science. Now, you hear he's a great economist, okay? Where does behavioral science come in, except that these were the prime plump years that Richard Helms and the CIA were doing mind control experiments on people all over the country and in the prisons, and their acid was being flown out and around every place that the hippies were, and this was the year of Altamont, and Timothy Leary with his 34 million assets going around her, the laboratory. I had a figure last week that was outrageous. So he's a fellow at the advanced studies of behavioral science, and now he's our ambassador to every country in the world, and he's president of Bechtel, with their huge slave labor occupation of countries. And I'm going to share with you later in the weeks to come the way they hire people to build Saudi Arabia. It's not that they're just building it. They are bringing them in for 2 or 3 years to sleep on cells. They can't have partners, their wives, sexual activity. They live as prisoners. They can't meet the people in town. They can't use the money in Saudi Arabia, so the royal family or the slaves. And they're brought in to work and sleep on cots and get X amount of calories and go to bed and work 7 days a week for 2 years, and they're shipped back to Indonesia and South Korea and Taiwan and Philippines with a few $1,000s, or India. That is what is building the Bechtel billions. They were 50% up in profits last year. It's privately owned, so they don't account to anybody. And goodness knows how many people fell by the wayside with diseases or whatever. This is the man who's the president of that corporation. And then after his year of behavioral science, and isn't that a funny one? He becomes the Secretary of Labor in 1968 to 69 for Richard Nixon during the whole Teamster turmoil. And then he works for the Office of Management Budget from 1970 to 72. Corruption was ripe. I have many articles going back 10 years, and I pulled some of them out to share with you. And then he was Secretary of the Treasury, 72 to 73. Now, John Connally was Secretary of the Treasury until 72. May the 15th, George Wallace was shot in Laurel, Maryland, and ran out of the competition against Richard Nixon, May the 15th. The next day, John Connally runs back to Texas, and in comes George Shultz, becomes Secretary of the Treasury. 2 weeks earlier, J. Edgar Hoover had been murdered by the anti-Castro Cubans, the Watergate gang. I have a picture of the car they took him off in. There was no hearse or nothing. It was like a mob hit. He's taken away, and May the 15th, Wallace is shot. May 16th, Connally goes back to Texas. He's part of Permindex, the Italian Licio Gelli, organized crime assassination teams, and I'll do more on Connally and that team, and he takes over the Treasury. And then when the ship is sinking, as I say, he goes out to Bechtel, and they call him a California mafia or clan. Now, I'm doing more on Bechtel and Shultz next week, but I do want to take one more minute or a minute and a half to talk about this station, even though, as I say, these tapes go to other countries, they go to other cities, they go to Canada, to Banff, to Ontario, to Vancouver. They're going all over. And if you saw my mail last week, I spent 2 days just answering it. There were letters from Alabama and Wisconsin and Milwaukee and Bakersfield and San Francisco and all over the country. And it would do your heart good to know that there are people out there studying these problems, ordering books, asking for copies of articles, asking for tapes. All of this is possible. I could do it. I did for a while on tape cassettes, but it's better to be on the air because you reach so many more people. So if you want to, and if you appreciate this kind of news, because it isn't often, and it isn't that you get the opportunity to get somebody sharing their 17 years research with you every week, please send a check to KAZU and tell them you appreciate World Watchers. You may not agree with what I say, but years later, if you tape it off the air or get the tapes and listen to them, you'll call me back and say, my God, I appreciate what you did. I wish I had done more 10 years ago or 8 years ago or 6. I get that all the time. Don't look back and say, I wish I had. Send a check now. I never ask anything for myself. I never have. I've done this work, radio work, for 11 years and never asked for anything. But send it to this station, and the address is Box 206, Pacific Grove, California, 93950 if you write. And now the hour is over, you can call and pledge or send a letter, 375-3082 if you want to make a pledge to the station. This is Mae Brussell, and I'll be back with you next week. Take it easy, and we'll share some more next week.